And we are live. Hello and welcome to the Headway channel, where we try to make headway by, you guessed it, using our heads. In this episode, we talk to Stephen Hicks, a professor of philosophy at Rockford University in Illinois. He is also the executive director at the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship and is a senior scholar at the Atlas Society. His writings, which have been translated into 16 languages, include 6 books: The Art of Reasoning, Readings for Logical Analysis, Nietzsche and the Nazis, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, Entrepreneurial Living, Liberalism, Pro and Con, and 8 Philosophies of Education, forthcoming in 2021. Stephen was recently a guest of Carl Benjamin, otherwise known as Sargon of Akkad, and we have the distinct privilege of speaking with him today about contemporary postmodernism. Welcome, Stephen.
Hey, welcome. Thanks a lot for the welcome, Brian.
So the questions I prepared are, I'm calling them up here now. So, postmodernism, it seems to be a topic of the day lately. A lot of people are discussing it in lay circles more than usual. And, there tends to be a focus on the French philosophers, which is for good reason. But, often the Frankfurt School gets overlooked. And so, no conversation about postmodernism is truly complete without some discussion about them. Can you describe a bit about the role that the Frankfurt School played in historically linking Marxism with a contemporary postmodern thought? What did Adorno, Horkheimer, and company get right? Where did they go wrong? What was wrong with the Enlightenment?
Yeah, well, that's a nice trio of questions right there. I'm not at all a fan of the Frankfurt School, but you're right. As a matter of intellectual history, they are extraordinarily important. So they are figures who are coming intellectually of age in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And the important point intellectually for them is that they all start off as members of the far left. And at that point, it means they are pretty much doctrinaire Marxists. At the same time, they are intelligent enough to be aware of the criticisms of Marxism. And then by the time we're getting into the second quarter of the 20th century, it's pretty clear that it's almost 75 years or so, 3 generations or so since classical Marxism was articulated, that both in terms of the theory and the practice, things aren't going the way classical Marxism says. So, of course, one can just be a pig-headed person and have your ideological beliefs and stick with them no matter what. But people who are more intelligent and who have some sense of actually being social scientists are going to take counter-arguments seriously. They're going to take the historical evidence seriously, and they're going to do some rethinking. So they are already starting to be neo-Marxists, and that then is to say keeping the main fundamentals of Marxism in place, but doing some significant alterations such that you're no longer just parroting the Marxist line, you are introducing some innovation. So Frankfurt School is a kind of neo-Marxism. Now, big topic, and there are a number of disagreements among the Frankfurt School, but the main thing is to see Marxism as too narrowly focused on economics. So the idea of Marxism is to be very reductionistic, so to say everything that goes on in society is a matter of social determinism, but the fundamental aspects of society that determine everything are economic forces. And so it's not going to be legal forces or political forces or religious forces or other kinds of possible social forces. The Marxists reduce everything to economics. And the Frankfurt School is going to be among the rethinkers of classical Marxism to say, well, Marxism is right to say that economics is important, but economics is not the sole or the fundamentally determining force, that there are other social aspects that perhaps need to be given equal weight or perhaps even more weight. So that is a quick version to broaden the number of social forces at work.
And so, to the second part of the question, I know I kind of packed three questions together there.
Yeah, that's fine.
So Adorno, Horkheimer, and the rest of them, what did they get right? And where did they go wrong? So clearly, they seem to have some retrospection. Obviously, they wouldn't have been taking things seriously. They might have just abandoned the whole project. So what did they get right? What did they get wrong?
Yeah, well, I don't think they got anything right, frankly, because if you're going to talk about things that are philosophically important, I mean, any thinker, no matter how much you disagree with them, can get some basic things right or some trivial things right. So, but if we focus on the important things, I think everything they argue is wrong. Largely epistemologically and metaphysically, they're coming out of a Kantian framework. Mixed in with a kind of Marxist framework with a little bit of Hegelianism thrown in there. And then by the time we get into the second quarter of the 20th century, Freudian psychoanalysis is all the rage. And one of the things, of course, that the Frankfurt School thinkers, several of them are going to do is to say that we need to add some kind of Freudian psychoanalytic theory to Marxist cultural analysis. And I'm not at all a fan of Freudian psychoanalytic theory. So I think what we have is people who are working in a completely inappropriate philosophical territory, but they are becoming increasingly sophisticated at repackaging and bringing in some other philosophical theories that I think are also wrong-headed to try to patch up what's from the beginning a wrong theory. So in the general, my answer would be say nothing.
I see. So basically, because it sounds, to at first blush, you might think that they were acknowledging, some of the faults of things that happen. I mean, it would be kind of hard to ignore, right?
Sure.
So maybe they were having a rethink, but it sounds to me from what you're saying is that they were really just kind of repackaging and doubling down. Is that right?
Right. Sure. So, for example, one of the things that's part of, say, Horkheimer and Adorno in their famous book Dialectics of Enlightenment. So they're being very critical of the Enlightenment, and I'm a huge advocate of the Enlightenment. But what we find is that they will use any philosophical strategy developed since the Enlightenment, and that's various forms of follow-up Kantianism, various forms of Marxism, Nietzscheanism, Freudianism, and so forth. So they're highly critical of the Enlightenment. And part of the famous thesis they want to argue is that something like the National Socialists, the Nazis, whom are now everyone's bad boys, that rather than seeing the Nazis as anti-Enlightenment, which I think they were, as anti-individualistic, as anti-rational, the blame storming that's starting to go on in the wake of the Nazis is then the Frankfurt School wants to say that somehow the Nazis are a product of the Enlightenment, and that way they can distance the Nazis from their sort of project. And I think that's just a wrong-headed thesis altogether. The Nazis were anti-Enlightenment. They were anti-reason in their epistemology. They were anti-individualistic in their moral theories and in their political theories. They were anti-universalistic, arguing that there are kind of different tribes and different races of human beings with different moral and political standings, right, and so forth. So all of the major claims of the Enlightenment, the Nazis were opposed to it. So what we find, though, is that the Nazis were collectivist, and the Frankfurt School are also collectivist. But since the Nazis are so bad, they are looking for any sort of philosophical strategy that can distance the Nazis from any part of the philosophical territory that they think is still appropriate.
So then, what would the reason be that they would then go against the Enlightenment? What arguments did they? I mean, you basically made it clear that you disagree with them. So, but what were the arguments they were putting forward? What was the appeal to those arguments?
Well, I think so the Enlightenment is a huge project. So it's science friendly, it's nature friendly. It's not necessarily antagonistic to the belief in a God, but the kind of God that you're going to have to believe in if you're an Enlightenment figure is going to be a God who can be proven, who's going to be kind of an architect God who created the natural world and gave it natural laws. So you're not going to believe in any sort of whimsical, mysterious kind of God. But the tendency of the Enlightenment was to be much more naturalistic and much more rational. The Enlightenment is also individualistic. Every individual should have the right to their own life, the right to the pursuit of happiness, the right to free choices, and so on, and that these rights were increasingly seen as universalistic. So all of the ethnic rivalries started to retreat. The idea that there's something morally repugnant about slavery is an Enlightenment idea. The second or third class status of women, and starting to fight back against that. All of that is also a product of the Enlightenment. So if I were to boil that down to two important things, I would say the Enlightenment, first and foremost, was a pro-reason movement and a pro-individual movement. And what we find is there's a counter reaction against that by philosophers who don't think that human beings are very rational, right? Or they look at the arguments that try to articulate all of the applications of reason, most thoroughly in scientific method, and come to skeptical conclusions about most of the elements of the scientific method. So counter-Enlightenment figures, and I'm going to put the Frankfurt School as like a 1.5 century later devolution coming out of counter-Enlightenment. By the time we get to them, all of the anti-reason arguments are going to be seen within the philosophical territory that they are hanging out as conclusive. And so they are anti-rationalist thinkers. But also the individualism of the Enlightenment was also assaulted by all sorts of counter-Enlightenment figures. So we find this in Jean-Jacques Rousseau. A generation later, we find it in Hegel. Clearly, Marxism is an anti-individualistic philosophy as well. And so the new forms of collectivism that come into existence are developed in much more philosophically rigorous form as the 1800s goes on and as the early 1900s go on. And so all of the Frankfurt School thinkers are kind of deep drinkers from the well of collectivism. And so they are not only anti-rational, but also anti-individualistic. So from their perspective, the individualism and the pro-reason philosophy of the Enlightenment, they just see it as a non-starter, as something that has been defeated intellectually and should just be set aside.
Okay, that's a pretty strong criticism there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's right.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, I know we're going to be talking about critical race theory and critical gender theories and all of the critiques, which are another 3 generations later from Frankfurt School, a little bit later, but it is the same anti-rational arguments and anti-individualist arguments in just kind of repackaged form that we're dealing with now. So yes, the philosophical territory is pretty deep.
Right. And you did mention some of these more contemporary manifestations, I've been following some of the other discussion on the topic from people like James Lindsay, and he sort of outlines the Frankfurt School a bit as well. And from that, I kind of gleaned that it seems to me that in some respects, the Frankfurt School was paradoxically prescient. So, for example, while their description of the culture industry was intended as a criticism of capitalism, it's commodified a sort of soft sell cultural Marxism. Today, we see the emergence of a one-dimensional man coming on the scene, but not as a drone of capitalism, but rather an anti-capitalist character. So how is it that this could happen?
The one-dimensional man thesis coming from Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s. There are lots and lots of variations of that kicking around starting in the 1800s. Right? So going back to Nietzsche's description of the last man, kind of a desiccated person who doesn't have any capacity for generating values of his own, who leads a kind of prepackaged life, is more concerned with conformity and so on. And from Nietzsche's perspective, this is now in the late 1800s. This is a product primarily of a spiritual crisis of the West, the death of religion, and our culturally not having come up with a replacement for what religion had done for us for a couple of millennia. And you can find versions of it even earlier in Marx. Marx is, in one sense, he's a fan of the proletariat or a champion of the proletariat, but at the same time, he sees the proletariat as having been kind of thoroughly exploited to the point where the actual existing proletariat of the mid-19th century, he sees them as dehumanized, one-dimensional kinds of individuals who have been kind of totally constructed by and deconstructed. That's actually some anachronistic language, but have been dehumanized to the point where they're not really living a fully human life, or even a partially human life. So the critique remains the same from mid 1800s to late 1800s to early 20th century in the Frankfurt School, and then a more mature version of the Frankfurt School by the time we get to the 1960s. And so it's in many cases it's a rhetorical repackaging. So Marcuse's one-dimensional man is not particularly original. It's a long-standing thesis arguing that either modernity or the Enlightenment or capitalism or liberal democracy prevents people from living a fully human life, and so that's the critique. So I don't know that it's particularly prescient, but certainly in the 1960s, he's the one who packaged it in an attractive form to what was then the new left, and so he became a kind of guru for the last two generations of that brand of cultural criticism.
Right. So yeah, and when I said prescient, I meant more like in a paradoxical way. So the predictions that they provided were of some outside totalitarian force that they were trying to prevent, but instead I think they kind of accidentally built it up instead.
So give me an example of what you mean by they built it up instead.
So for example, when Herbert Marcuse wrote Repressive Tolerance,
right,
it was forwarded as a bulwark against totalitarianism, right? They were so determined that we're not going to have any totalitarianism. We're not going to let any of it leak in. We're not going to have the bad guys sneak in the back door. So paradoxically, it's become a fuel for the modern day one-dimensional man now to engage in efforts to totalize. So, I mean, like, wasn't Adorno himself one of the first public figures to be canceled? Like, wasn't there an incident where he got booed off stage or something?
Well, among the left, and especially the far left, the idea of what we now call canceling is again just an old phenomenon of using any method, fair or foul, to silence the opposition. And the left especially has been marked by schisms and kind of internal purges of people who don't toe various party lines all the way through. So even before Adorno, if he runs afoul of a particular left orthodoxy, that's also not news.
So it sounds like these are some pretty bad ideas that they're putting forward, which kind of makes you wonder why do people find that so appealing? What is give me tell me why the snake oil salesman is wrong, and what's the what is the appeal of the lie, and what's the antidote?
Yeah, well, that's another rich question. And I think for that kind of question, you always have to have at least two answers. One is a more philosophical answer, and one that appeals to psychology. So if the snake oil is in one form, right, you are a victim. If your life sucks, or if you feel incapable of taking on life's challenges, it's not your fault, it's someone else's fault, and you then start the blame storming game. I think that kind of psychology is as old as human beings. And in every generation, there are always philosophies and sometimes religions available that people will turn to in order to avoid taking responsibility for their lives. And in that case, I think it's a psychological problem. It becomes a psychological defense mechanism, right? So if I fail, or I don't feel that I'm up to the challenge, I can say it's because, and then there's some other group that I can name that has a certain amount of power, and they have rigged the rules of the game against me, or they've disempowered me in some particular way. So it's a kind of excuse making, and there's going to be a certain kind of psychology in every generation of people who are willing to go down that road. Now, I think what's different about our age and our generation, what's particularly shocking in Western civilization, that's now becoming global civilization, where arguably people are living longer, and we have more wealth available to us. Even if you're a poor person in Canada or the United States, the amount of wealth that you have available to you is astounding. The amount of technologies that are empowering to you are just astounding. So it's a bit surprising then demographically to see how many people seem to be arguing that in some way that they don't have any power, that they don't have any opportunities, that the rules of the game are rigged against them, and so forth. So that's a little bit shocking. And here I think it's a testament to the power of ideas, particularly philosophical ideas, because in a healthy intellectual culture, what's going to happen when you've got people who are tempted to play the victim card and to see themselves as disempowered? What the healthy intellectuals are going to do, and this is going to be the journalists and the teachers and the parents, right, and so forth, is help the people who are feeling disempowered, or maybe that they're not up to the challenges of life, to realize, right, all of the resources that are available to them, and to work on their psychology, to work on their self-esteem, to build up their confidence, and to point out opportunities, and to put them in social networks that are going to be support networks, right, and so forth, so that people then have a way to get out of the temptations of not trying, and the temptation of letting your fears and self-doubts get the better of you, and thereby throw your life away. So what we though find in the past generation especially, and I think if you push it back maybe 2 generations, is increasingly the intellectuals who should be building people up have instead bought into a dysfunctional ideology. For shorthand, we'll call it postmodernism, that does not do that. It does not build people up. It intentionally tears people down, sabotages them, and undermines their capacity for overcoming whatever self-doubts they have. So instead of having an intellectual class that is doing its job properly and building people cognitively in a healthy direction, building people psychologically in a healthy direction, it's undercutting their capacity for cognition by giving them all of these extraordinarily skeptical arguments and cynical arguments, and undercutting their self-esteem, and thereby generating a larger number of people who are damaged by the time they leave formal schooling.
Well, so it does sound quite pernicious what's happening. My observation from my personal perspective, I was born in just the last 6 months of the 1960s, and I got a bit of a taste of some of the sentiment of that era. And there was the sort of the hippie generation and the human rights movement, and it seemed like there was a big push for change and to try and do something with the world. I think that there is a certain enthusiasm in youth, that people have a lot of energy and they want to change the world. And if something
Mm.
sucks, they want to be useful. They want to, they want their lives to
Oh,
mean
yeah.
something. And so, they get behind these movements. And in the 60s, I think you could say for sure that there were definitely some things to fight for. Uh,
Mm.
like the human rights movement, for example. And I think it's somewhat natural in the human condition for, let's say, for example, teenagers they're finding their identity, and one of the ways that they do that is to reject the identity imposed on them by their parents, whether it's a accurate or helpful one or
Mm.
not. They're just opposed for the sake of opposing. And so I could see rebellious propaganda being appealing to them, and then they get caught up in this, and then
Mm.
then you've got some university or college prof who's saying, yeah, well, let's fight the system and take it down.
Mm.
um, the 60s human rights movement did make an impact. There was a lot of chaos, and there were some bad actors there too. But I find that what we see now, and it's just my opinion, but I think that there's a young generation of people coming up, these millennials. They have that same impulse. They have a desire to do something good for the world. They have a lot of energy and drive. They say, oh, I want to make a difference. They want to
Mm.
have to be useful. The 60s seemed like a cool thing, fight for human rights. Like, that's really great. Why can't we punt that ball a little further down the road? And so I think, at least on behalf of the people that maybe fall for these ideas, I think they're, maybe at least initially, their heart is in the right place.
Mm.
And that's what I would sort of attribute to a lot of the appeals of these, identitarian politics. They want to stand up
Mm.
for the underdog and so on and so forth. But it's not really the same echo. We've got critical race theory and all these other type of identity theories. Maybe if you can just sort of contrast and spell out what are some of the differences between critical race theory today and the human rights movement of the 60s. Does this postmodern approach help to advance the goals of that effort, or does it affect change counter to those ends?
Yeah, that's a nicely put together a couple of minutes summary of the 60s and now. Let me say a few things. Yeah, clearly the 60s are an important decade. And this is a little bit too cartoonish, but if you think in terms of decades, the 1930s depression, right, and everybody's the terrible economic circumstances, the 1940s world war, horrible stuff preoccupying everybody's mind, millions of people dying in war and all of the uncertainties there, and on top of that, the Holocaust and the absorption of that. And then, 1950s, basically everybody takes a breather, is rebuilding, maybe the beginnings of rock and roll music, right, and so forth. The economy is rebuilt, and people are feeling finally that maybe we can start to have more normal lives again. And then by the time you get to the 1960s, it's a new generation coming of age. They are in a free country. They are in a wealthy country. And as you point out very nicely, they've got the fire in the belly about wanting to make their lives meaningful and significant, make the world a better place, and all of those things that are beautiful about being a young person. Now, at the same time, the 1960s is a world of much more intellectual diversity than previous decades are going on. And there's all of the Enlightenment philosophy is still strong, and it's largely institutionalized in many parts of Western culture. The progress that's going on in the sciences is still great and astounding. The progress in medicine, the progress in engineering. It's all astounding. And medicine, all of this is very progressive and so on. And then there's a realization, of course, that while the battle against slavery and the second-class status of women has made great strides in the past 2 centuries, there are still some pretty major pockets of sexism, pockets of racism as part of our culture, and kind of the idea that, damn it, we should be able to do something about it. But at the same time, on both of those issues, I think the first thing that happens in the 1960s is that there's an important re-energization or re-energizing rather of a more collectivist approach to those problems, the remaining problems of racism and sexism, that starts to fight against the more individualistic philosophical battle against racism and sexism. So what you find explicitly in the 1960s is we need to continue to get rid of racism and sexism, just to focus on those two for now. And one side is arguing, well, we've been very effective using these ideas of individual rights, judging people on the basis of their character, and getting rid of any double standards in the law that hold individuals back, and making sure that each individual has the knowledge and the power and the freedom to get on with their life. And so that individualistic philosophical and cultural battle is still strong and making strides, and is still very attractive to millions and millions of people. But there also is a resurgent collectivism that wants to argue, in order to fight against the remaining racism and sexism, we need to stop focusing on individuals so much, and we need to change the focus to groups. That it's men as a group against women as a group, or it's whites and blacks and browns and so on as a group against these various other groups. And so the resurgent collectivism comes to be a very prominent part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and it is an important part of the overall civil rights movement, along with all of the more individualistic ones. The civil rights movement of the 1960s has some common targets. We're against racism, we're against sexism, and so forth, but they have very different philosophical, ethical, and strategic ways of trying to do so. So what we then find is that's the big battle that we have in the 1960s, the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. And probably the biggest skirmish where we can see this going on is over affirmative action. So there are great protagonists for affirmative action and great antagonists with respect to affirmative action. Everybody who is participating in that debate absolutely despises racism, despises sexism. But the difference is, do you think if you're going to fight against racism and sexism, you should treat people as individuals and judge everybody according to the same standards, and just make sure that we have all of the standards of justice and merit and an opportunity applied to all individuals equally, that we're just getting rid of all double standards? And on the other side, you have people who are wanting to say, no, we are against racism and sexism, but the only way we're going to solve this problem is by collectivizing the problem and saying whites as a group did bad things to the other races as a group. And so now what we need to do is have a kind of double standard and favor the people in this group and disfavor people in this other group. And so it was totally a group analysis. Or men as a group did bad things to women as a group. And so in the neighbor of a kind of gender affirmative action, we're going to have to favor women as a group and disfavor men as a group, and so forth. So the whole debate over affirmative action as part of the broader civil rights movement turns on whether you're an individualist or a collectivist. Now, by the time we get to our generation, we still have large numbers of people who are in both of those two camps, but the critical race theorists and the critical gender theorists of our generation disagree with both of those camps. So a very interesting thing, for example, is if you look at the critical race theorists, and one very quick way of testing where they stand on these issues is to ask them, what do they think about Martin Luther King? What do they think about Frederick Douglass? And what you will find is the critical race theorists hate Frederick Douglass. they hate Martin Luther King. And that's a very strong indicator that whatever anti-racism means to them, it means something quite different. So in the case of Martin Luther King, for example, his most famous phrase is, that we should be judging people by the content of their character. And what that means is that we should be judging people not on the basis of superficial characteristics into which we can divide people into various groups and so forth, but rather on the basis of someone's character. But your character is a highly individualistic thing. Are you an honest person or a dishonest person? Do you have integrity or are you a hypocrite? Are you committed to following through and persevering, or are you a lazy person and so forth, and inclined to blame the world around you for what happens to you in your life? So if you think individual character matters, and that all individuals should be free and have the opportunities to stand on their own 2 feet and make it in a hopefully free world to pursue their dreams. That Martin Luther King version is the opposite of what contemporary critical race theory stands for. And that's why you will find them explicitly saying, we think Martin Luther King is an individualist guy. We think he believes in universal rights, right, and so forth, and we don't believe in any of that. Critical race theory is anti-individualistic. It wants to argue that your character is not something that you control. It is something that, whatever we want to call character, is molded in you by social forces beyond your control. And that those social forces are group collectivist in orientation. Individuals have no power to determine their own selves or their own identities in any particular way. And all of the groups that are out there are not by and large populated by individuals who are rational and well-meaning and who may have made some mistakes. And so by treating each other civilly, we can get past our disagreements. The critical race theorists are arguing those groups are locked into I hate you, you hate me, knock them down, all's fair in love and war, power struggle for domination. And so there's absolutely no way, that Martin Luther King's individualistic judge people by their character, and ultimately we should have a society of free and equal individuals living the dream. It's a much more cynical, collectivized, adversarial, anti-rational philosophy. So I think what we are dealing with right now at a minimum, and even this is a little bit too crude, is people who are still Enlightenment individualists on these issues of race and sex, who are still fighting that particular fight. I'm in that group, by the way. People who are collectivized, but we would see them now as members of the more reasonable left, who want to argue that there are universal standards of fairness, universal standards of equality, and we should be striving for those, but they just want to argue that we need to have robust tools of affirmative action and strong government manage of various parts of the culture wars in order to achieve their vision of egalitarian fairness. But the critical race theorists represent a resurgent new group that is now potent, but coming from a very different philosophical territory.
Very well said.
Thank you.
Going back to the Martin Luther King, and I have a dream that one day my grandchildren, I'm probably not paraphrasing this perfectly correct, but
go for it. We all know the spirit of it.
Be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin.
Yes,
and that's something that always resonated with me. And it doesn't mean that you don't recognize that someone is black or whatever color, brown, etc.
Right.
Of course, unless you're literally blind, you could never overlook that.
Right. So colorblind is a metaphor here. It's not to say that you're not aware, right, that there are all kinds of perceptual differences between people. But the point is that in many or most contexts, those features are not relevant. So a person's race is not relevant when you're choosing a doctor, for example, right, or deciding who's going to get into law school. And so you ignore that feature as irrelevant to that context.
Right, and it's not meant to be, tossing aside or setting aside any historical context that person's family might have had, or experiences that they might have had from previous generations coming
No,
forward.
absolutely. Yeah, no,
There's,
no. Yeah, facts are facts, including historical facts, and history has an influence, and so we take all of those things into account for sure.
that's right. And so for me, one of the tipping points on all of this wokeism was the nail in the coffin for me was when I got to understand a little bit more about, we're moving away from the Frankfurt School now, but Kimberly Crenshaw, when she wrote, was it Mapping Outside the Margins or Inside the Margins?
Something like that. Yes. Yeah.
And all this stuff about intersectionality, it started out, when you read about the lawsuit, was it DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors, where there was a lawsuit between a black woman and the company, and she sued on the grounds that she was being discriminated against as a black woman, even though the court found that, well, the company was employing black men and white women, but they weren't employing any black women. So the concept of intersectionality was meant to be a counter to that, to say, well, but I'm still being discriminated against by the intersection of my identity. And the court ruled that, well, you can't multiply your standing. And I thought that was very interesting, because it does make it, for a sticky problem, and it's an interesting one. But then she lost that case, and I don't know if there was any discrimination found. I don't think there was, but I would say that if somebody was discriminated against in any of those areas, then it's discrimination, and that's fine. You don't have to multiply your standing. You can still have 1 point and still win, right? But because she lost that case, instead of maybe rethinking what happened, and sometimes the court can make an error, right? She doubled down and she said, no, the intersectionality really is the thing. And she, in fact, herself, she said that a critical race theory and or maybe it's intersectionality, is a provisional bridge between politics and postmodernism. So, and she further goes on to argue that the identity is the essence, that you cannot reduce for all of the postmodernism and theory in deconstructing something. They stop at identity, as and so you can't get past that. You can't say, well, you can't drill down to the individual, because that's a hard limit for her. And so what you end up having is, in computer science, they call it a halting problem, where the algorithm just keeps running because you can never solve it down to the last answer. And that really struck me, because it's the antithesis of what Martin Luther King had to say about judging somebody by the content of their character and not the color of their skin.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that, maybe there was an argument to be made, especially in that court case. But there's, again, there's this rhetorical effort to try and frame things in a way that put forward a certain position. It's sort of saying that, well, if logic doesn't work, I'll use something else. And it seems to me like that's what postmodernism often does. When Lyotard had this idea, to be skeptical of grand narratives, I think there's some valid value in that. But these ideas, they cherry these postmodernists, these contemporary critical race theorists and other theory people, they cherry pick even from postmodernism. So, for example, where Lyotard might have said, let's be skeptical of grand narratives, they're constructing this really, really high level cultural Marxist grand narrative of, systemic racism and whiteness as white supremacy, and centering whiteness. And most people are just looking at that saying, I'm not doing that. They say, no, it's not you, it's the system.
Yes.
So it seems to me that there's a lot of trappings in there. What can the average person do to identify these abuses of postmodernism? Because I think a lot of people, they just kind of get blindsided when somebody comes at them with one of these like pseudo rational arguments, How can somebody identify those abuses?
Well, okay. So that's an interesting three set issue you're putting there. One about identity politics in a particular court case, and then the second about epistemological issue about narratives and meta-narratives and skepticism and so on. And then a transition through some kind of things that seem like rhetorical sleight of hand or inappropriate rhetorical tactics that the average person, who's going to be an intelligent person but not necessarily trained in critical theory or postmodern rhetoric, but they sense that something fishy or suspect is going on, and what they can and should do about it. So yeah, let me say just a couple of words or a couple of sentences about each of those. Yeah, the phrase identity politics is interesting because really it's a thesis about human nature, about what human identity is. So by the time in our generation we get to the current iteration package that we call identity politics, it's already coming out of a long philosophical, psychological, and sociological tradition that wants to argue that human beings really are just the intersection of a Venn diagram, and that there is no individual, there is no autonomy. So the idea, that you as an individual, you have some capacity to think for yourself. Of course, you're born into a family context, you're born into an ethnic context, you're born into a linguistic context, political context, religious context. So you are born into all of these social contexts, but that you as an individual have the capacity to think about each one of them as you come to maturity, to decide which ones you are going to accept, which ones you are going to reject. All of that is rejected, right, by a position called structuralism. And we now typically are calling it social constructionism. So the individual gets dissolved. And in a way, it's the old debate between free will and determinism. And it's the determinist side saying that you don't have any free will, you don't have any choice, you don't have any agency. And so consequently, you don't have any responsibility. You are totally a product of all of the social forces that you are born into. So you are, to use the, did you have plasticine when you were a kid, or Play-Doh?
Sure,
right?
sure.
And you're just born as a lump of Play-Doh, and all of these different social forces are manipulating the Play-Doh and constructing you into whatever it is that you end up being. So, but it's not a crude social determinism like Marxism, that wants to say it's all you are just a product of your economic class, right? The intersectionalists want to say, partly it's your economic class, partly it's your racial identity, partially it's a foisted upon you gender identity, an ethnic identity, and so forth. And you're just the intersection of the Venn diagram, if that metaphor makes sense. So as a result of that, it does follow that if you are the intersection of one Venn diagram and I'm the intersection of a very different Venn diagram, there is no way that you and I really can have a meaningful conversation, because all of the words that we use are going to have different meanings and different value significances. And you and I will have been constructed to believe very different things religiously, even different scientific theories, different mathematical theories, different ideas about what's fair, just, and so on. So the idea that we can have, as individuals, a meeting of the minds, that's all nonsense. And so all we have is, you've got your subjectively or social subjectively constructed set, I've got mine. If they are different, we're just going to collide. And in that collision, it doesn't really matter what tools we use. All we want to do is make sure that our value set and our belief set prevails.
Right.
So everything
you just don't understand my lived experience, and you never.
That's right, and they believe that's true, right? And I can't understand your lived experience, and you can't understand my lived experience, right? And so forth. So what's the point of me even trying to read your narrative and understand your narrative, or be sympathetic, right? And so on. And coincidentally, this is one of the reasons why history education becomes not only just weak in the sense that the older generation is always complaining about how little history the new generation knows. It's a self-conscious. What's the point of trying to understand history? Because history is all these other cultures who had very different constructions, and there's no way that 21st century Canadians or Americans can get outside of their Venn diagram to understand some other Venn diagram. It's completely pointless. So history education and the idea that there are kind of universal lived experiences that we can encounter, that goes by the by. So history starts to seem kind of pointless. So let's use the narrative point to transition to your second theme, which was about Lyotard and skepticism about grand narratives. So Lyotard is a philosophy PhD, and so he is well schooled in all of early 20th century epistemology and the history of epistemology and so on. And he is coming of age at a point when philosophy, academic philosophy in particular, is at a very skeptical place, right? So the idea that our senses put us in contact with the world, that our abstract concepts in some sense map onto the way the world is, that logic and mathematics and statistics and experimental method and so on, that all of those are legitimate, validated processes. He is part of a generation that buys into all of the very skeptical arguments that had been developed. So the idea that somehow doing science or doing anything that we can come up with a true picture about the way the world works in some huge domain like biology and evolutionary theory being a big narrative, right? Or genetics being a big narrative, or the Big Bang cosmology being a big narrative, or that we can take the four fundamental forces of physics that the physicists are worrying their way through and try to come up with a grand unified theory that's going to put them all together. All of that, if you are a skeptic, just seems impossible. Okay? And so we're not going to try to do big theory in the sciences. But of course, Lyotard and the others of his generation were strong Marxists as youths. And Marxism is, of course, a grand narrative. It says, here is the big picture about how everything is going to play out. And if you're a young Marxist and you buy into this theory, right, this is a great narrative. You think it's beautiful. You think it's wonderful. It forms an identity, right, of yourself, right? But then if you are living through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, that grand narrative of Marxism comes to be a pretty big disappointment to you. You've got the revelation of Stalin's genocides and democides in the 30s and the 40s, and the Soviet Union is revealed to be a huge fraud, right, and so on. So that, I think, is a crisis for someone like Lyotard, who is and always was a man of the far left. And so the idea then is that if this Marxist narrative that I have been believing for all of my young life is revealed as a failure, what does that do to you psychologically? Well, you go through a crisis of faith, and then you start to believe, well, maybe there is no truth, maybe there is no meaning, maybe there is no grand story, and so forth. And all of those very normal psychological paths that people go through when they come to lose faith in a big story of the universe that they held passionately when they are younger. So I think in the case of someone like Lyotard, who's getting a philosophical training and comes to be very skeptical philosophically about all of the claims of science and reason and logic and so forth. But at the same time, he is, as a young man, a strongly politicized individual who bought into a strong form of classical Marxism, but comes to be demoralized about Marxism. That's two very harsh blows. And that's going to lead someone to say, well, I guess there are no true narratives. And this idea that we can find grand narratives, we should be skeptical about that. The best we can do is tell much smaller stories about ourselves, about our groups, and make them very modestly, and recognize that there are other people out there who have very different stories and that they should be perhaps pretty modest. And so we have to basically just give up on figuring out or saying that somehow we can figure out anything beyond fairly small scale narratives. Now that's the second thing, and I know I'm doing more than just a couple of sentences on these ones as well.
No, that's good. That's great.
So then, what does this mean, though? And I think while it's fair to say that that we are living, I don't think we're living in a postmodern era. I think we still are living in an Enlightenment era, and in a broadly
for the most part
progressive era as well. But we do have, it's not as monolithic as things are. We do have a lot of significant minority contenders, and I don't think we can predict which way it's going to turn out. I have my hopes and my speculations there, but I think the postmodernism does generate the practical applications of identity politics and critical race theory and critical gender theory and wokeness and so forth that we are seeing right now. And as you were pointing out, it's a bit interesting that if postmodernism is supposed to be a skeptical movement about meta-narratives, how is it that we've got a large number, a very strongly motivated activist group that seem to be pretty convinced that they've got all of the right answers and that they want to impose it on all of society, and often in a fairly totalitarian fashion? Why aren't they skeptical about their own ideals, right? Or willing to be a little more modest or humble about them and say, this is just one more narrative that's out there, not the grand narrative, and so on. So I think here, again, we have to have a mixture of philosophy and psychology. And I think that it is a truth about human psychology, and it goes back to partly to a point that you were touching on earlier, that we do need to believe in something in our lives. And particularly when we are young people, we want to have genuine values and to make our own lives meaningful and to the broader world around us a better place. I think that's normal. I think that's healthy, right? And so on. So I think what can happen is that there will be intelligent individuals who are decent, well-meaning individuals. They will go to school and they will pay attention to what their high school teachers are saying. They will read books. They will go off to university and have more sophisticated professors with various kinds of expertises go to work on them. And so what they will do is they will drink from the postmodernist well, and they will, the most intelligent and well-read of them, come to believe with Lyotard that everything, all of these meta-narratives are just crap and we can't believe in them. And they will read a certain amount of Foucault and say, everything is power struggles and so forth. And so they will be intellectually convinced that a lot of that is true. But at the same time, they are young human beings who want meaning in their life. And it's very hard to give up on all of that. And it's very hard to live very long saying, well, I guess I don't know anything. I guess I shouldn't believe anything. I guess I shouldn't have any values, or because, all values are just subjective things that have been programmed into me. I guess I can't believe that there's anything that has genuine progress or genuine goodness in the world, according to my teachers. I think intellectually, people can take themselves into that world for a while, but it's very hard for anybody to stay there for very long. And so I think what happens is they will be intellectually convinced that everything is just subjective, but then they will say that, well, the fact is that I happen to have certain subjective values and they are meaningful to me. And if I'm going to have some sort of meaning and make a difference in the world, I might as well just double down and commit to my subjective values and my particular group's values. And I'm not going to argue that those are in some grand philosophical sense justified or true, because I don't believe I can do that, but they happen to be my values. And I'm going to make a kind of existentialist commitment or a leap of faith into my value set, and I can convince myself that that's the best, and I will have the sense by making that commitment and trying to follow through in the world, that I am living some sort of a genuine, meaningful life. And I think that's where a lot of the fervor comes in. And then, of course, it comes out in a somewhat totalitarian form, because the only way you can advance your group's agendas is against other people and their group's agenda.
Great. I know we've set aside an hour here, and I want to respect your time.
Oh my goodness, look at that. Time went flying by.
but if I can just squeeze one last question.
Okay, let's do it.
We've talked about this sort of the evolution of these ideas, and their manifestation in society, and with this woke movement seems to be all over the place, and finding its way into institutions and corporate trainings and so on and so forth.
Oh, yeah.
So what would you propose as a viable alternative to critical race theory, for example, for companies who genuinely want to be socially responsible and they want to support progress in the workplace and in the world, but maybe they don't want to go woke, but there isn't anything else out there. So if you were talking to,
well, yeah, let me, yeah, I think I know where your question's going, and yeah, there's lots of alternatives out there, and I think most decent people know what those alternatives are. If you're interested in racial issues in the workplace, then the obvious thing is don't be a racist. And I think in North America, most of the civilized world, 90+% of the people are not racist. Right. So this is too flip, but in your bones whether you're a racist or not. And so what I would say is, particularly standing up against the woke people who are really just functioning as bullies. They want to get you to doubt yourself and to take on unearned guilt so that they can manipulate you. And it's a well-worn tactic of the left, and it comes out in different cultural vehicles in every generation. And in longstanding religious traditions, right, the use of guilt to undermine healthy people's sense of self-esteem and own individual worth, that's well-worked territory. So I would say, if you're interested in making the world a better place, well, then just first be a decent person yourself. And we shouldn't, in North America and most parts of the civilized world, have to do a whole lot of work to get people to recognize what that means. So in the workplace in particular, you're making a certain kind of product, become highly skilled, and be able to recognize and admire and respect other people who are highly skilled at whatever it is. That's not that hard. Be knowledgeable. We all know when we are in the workplace who knows their stuff and who doesn't know their stuff, who's coming up with the interesting ideas and who really doesn't have very much to contribute. So knowledge and skills. We all know what it is to be treated fairly and unfairly. To what it is to steal credit for someone else's ideas, or to have their ideas stolen, right, and so forth. Don't do that. Be a fair person, be a just person, right, and so forth. And we all know that people of different races, different ethnicities, different genders, different whatevers are capable of being smart, skilled, fair-minded, or idiots and assholes, to put it bluntly, right? Sure. No group has a monopoly on those, or even a preponderance, right, of those sorts of things. So be rational. Be committed to being the best person that you can be, build your skills up, be a fair-minded person, and respect other individuals who are living up to those standards. That's the antidote to critical race theory, to critical gender theory, to critical religious theory. There's the whole panoply of them. Be good at your job, and deal with people who are also being willing to be good with their job. And I would say anybody who's in a management position or a leadership position, develop a spine, recognize wokeness for the combination of kind of sadism and power play that it is, right? It is a kind of sadism. I think it's a kind of low-grade sadism. The people who are doing the critical race theory, you don't know these people as individuals, but you march into a room and you start accusing them of racism and trying to pull all sorts of tactics to try to make them feel guilty and so on. You know what you are doing. That's an evil, sadistic tactic to destabilize a person's sense of their own moral self-worth. Anybody who is a decent, well-meaning person will start off with a presumption of innocence and give people the benefit of the doubt. And before you start throwing around accusations of racism, you damn well better have some pretty good evidence about that. That this is something that the person actually said, they meant it in a certain way, that there's a persistent habit of doing so before you pull out a big race card. So I would say don't give the wokeists, right, and the people who are using these tactics an entry into your company. Otherwise, you are drinking the poison.
Wow, strong, very, very strong last question there.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Yeah, because it's something I think about a lot, and because there are companies that I think, maybe they go into it well intentioned, and they don't know what the Kool-Aid tastes like, let's say.
Mm.
And I think that maybe if there were some new, let's say HR organizations that came out and they had an alternative program,
Yeah.
with because it's kind of a placeholder in a way, that there's a company that has a racism shaped hole, or at least in terms of having some kind of program to say we are not that thing,
Right.
and there are
I would say it's always going to be an ongoing issue. I mean, United States and Canada and much of the world, it's a cliche, but it's absolutely true. We're increasingly global. We're increasingly cosmopolitan, and particularly in the workplaces. So it's going to be an ongoing thing of bringing a new crop of people in from different parts of the world. Some of them are first, second, third generation immigrants, or they're bringing in different cultural training, backgrounds. So we are going to have ongoing training about how to be a decent human being and dealing with people of all kinds of different kinds of groups. But so recognize that, and of course go and have the human resources and the ethics trainings programs and so forth. The point just is, critical race theory and critical gender theory, those are poisons. Those are, in fact, racist, and they're going to make your workplace worse, and they're going to poison your relations with other businesses and with your customers. So part of your moral responsibility, I think, as a manager, as a leader, is not only to have some spine, but if you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to how to fight racism or how to fight sexism and so forth, then do some research, because the debate is out there, and there are lots of experts who know how to respond to critical race theory, and bring those people in as your consultants.
So I would say, maybe to put a bow on that, at least, I'm not claiming that to sum up what you're saying, but to put a bow on that, I would say probably the thing to focus on is to recognize people as individuals, not as groups.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And judge them on their merit. As Martin Luther King said, judge people by the content of their character and not.
Absolutely. Yep. No, that's a beautiful way to put the bow on it.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Stephen Hicks, professor at Rockford University in
Illinois. Yep.
In Illinois, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Hopefully we
get to see us again. Some very good, rich questions, and boy, the hour did fly by. All right, so all the best to you for your program, Brian.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, pleasure. Bye for now. Okay.